I'm not against raw feeding. I don't think dogs should be fed like wolves. Every single dog is different. Ultimately, it's going to come down to what suits your own dog best.
Hypoallergenic means that the food won't upset my dog with sensitivities.
Unfortunately, that is not true. Hypoallergenic is a made-up word. I believe it was made up by the cosmetic industry. There's no legal definition for it.
All additives in pet food are bad.
Well, this one's really super easy to answer because no, they're not all bad.
Vets get paid by food companies to sell the company's food.
It's just not true. They just don't get paid for that. When the reps for the veterinary companies come round, they show.
Welcome to the DAFY podcast, the place where you will get expert-led and science-backed advice on dog health and nutrition. No more confusion and no more conflicting opinions. Just clear guidance to help you make informed decisions for your pup. Because when it comes to our dogs, they deserve the very best care. And we, as dog parents, deserve confidence in the choices we make for them. Let's meet an expert. Fiona, welcome to the DAFY podcast. It's so great to have you on today.
Thank you. Looking forward to chatting.
Yes, likewise. Such an amazing topic today as well. So I'm really excited. But before we start, I just wanted to ask you, can you tell the audience a little bit about your background first?
Yeah, sure. I have been working in the pet food industry for, I hate to admit it because it shows how old I am, but over 20 years.
Don't look that old.
And that has been for various different pet food companies. So I want to be as transparent as possible. So lots of different pet food companies. I currently work for a pet food company as my full-time job, but I'm such a nutrition nerd that I also have a very small side hobby business in nutrition as well, because I like to be able to also give independent advice on everything from dry to raw to fresh to home cooked. So it's really good. My qualifications, I did an undergraduate degree in zoology, a master's in animal nutrition. And in between those, I just study because I just love learning and my brain gets bored if I don't do stuff. So I've covered animal behaviour. I'm a qualified hydrotherapist for dogs. I'm a qualified massage therapist as well.
That's amazing.
Lots of things.
Yeah, you never get bored basically for the rest of your life. You've picked yourself like the perfect industry, isn't it? Because everything changes. Like in general, dog health and nutrition industry is such a huge, there is science left and center, stuff coming out every single day. So it's, I definitely always say it's like one industry you can never get bored of if you're passionate about animals, which is really nice. And what made you get into like dog nutrition? What is the thing that made you really passionate about it?
It was by accident, if I'm totally honest. I finished my degree, my zoology degree. I found an advert in a local paper, yes, very old, looking for a nutritional advisor for a pet food company. And I thought, oh, that sounds quite interesting. And then I went there and got absolutely obsessed straight away. Had a really lovely boss that really encouraged CPD. So we went to all the vet conferences to get all the up-to-date knowledge on nutrition, but he also took us to all the alternative veterinary conferences, so the holistic ones where you would learn about homeopathy, herbal, raw food was just kicking off at that stage. So it wasn't just the sort of run-of-the-mill ones as well. Yeah, and just started my obsession, basically.
Love it. Absolutely love it. So you definitely got, and again, I'm going to say you don't look that old, but you've got loads of experience. Oh, it's exciting. So what we're covering today is something that I think most dog owners are going to absolutely love, because you just hear this all the time. You can see it between social media, online, Google. We are talking about the biggest dog nutrition myth out there. So we're going to cover 10, but there are a couple that came in through a poll that I ran on Instagram. So I want to try and get as many questions basically answered to dog owners as we can. So I'm going to crack on with the first one, and then let's see how we get on with time and things like that. I'll keep an eye on it. But the first one is, so grain-free food is better or more natural than grain-based food. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'm probably going to say this quite a lot tonight, but it depends.
Okay, I like that word.
Depends on a lot of factors. So if you've got a dog with a particular allergy, for example, and it has an allergy to a grain, you don't always know which grain they're allergic to. Actually, there's only a couple of true allergies that have been discovered. So one is in Irish setters. It's a gluten enteropathy, wheat gluten. And there's another one in border terriers, which is a sort of cramping epileptoid type problem. And that's again to gluten. But there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that dogs are intolerant or allergic to all types of grains. And some grains don't have gluten. You've got rice and maize. So if you're not sure, if you think and you suspect that, grain-free is really good because you're eliminating everything and you can just try it and see.
Yeah.
But for most dogs, a grain-based diet is actually fine. And grains produce a lot of, they're not just fillers, they have a lot of nutrients in there, they have fibre, so they can be really useful. The other thing is that if it's a dried food and you remove the grain, you have to replace it with something else, another carbohydrate, to keep the structure of the dry kibble together. So generally you would see potato or sweet potato or some legumes, and I'd say they're no more natural than a grain. You're not going to have a dog in the wild eating potato or sweet potato compared to like rice. It's not that more natural for them, but you could produce maybe a fresh diet that was completely low carb or carb free. So yeah, it depends on what you're feeding basically.
But also the carbs is they have fiber, and dogs need fiber in the diet. You can't just deprive the food completely, totally from the fiber content, because they do need it. It's good for digestion.
Yeah, good source of things like prebiotics as well, which are good for the gut.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that makes perfect sense. And you mentioned about studies. That's a big one, right? Because personally, I've been feeding Rusty a bit of gently cooked and a bit of raw over time. He started with kibble in his life, but then he went gently cooked raw. And like when I was trying to look, because as a dog owner, I just heard actually grain-free is better for a dog that tends to have a heart problem. But again, there is not research that shows that. And then they say, oh, actually, grain-free is bad for dogs. Honestly, all the research that I've seen is not really being studied for years or anything like that. And everywhere I look, saying there is not any research.
Yeah, it's really tricky for pet owners because, you hear all sorts of different points of view. And like you said, a few years ago, there was the big link between grain-free diets and a type of heart disease called dilated cardiomyopathy. They never really did get to the bottom of it. First of all, it only seemed to crop up in America, not in the UK. And we have different standards for formulating foods over here. We use different ingredients, different legislation. But a lot of the studies in America haven't managed to pinpoint what it was. It wasn't the lack of grains that might have been a problem. What they thought it was is what they were replacing it with. And at one point they thought it might have been those legumes like peas and beans. But even that, the evidence is a bit sketchy.
If there is no science behind it, it's no point believing it, basically, making big changes. Yeah. And then one last question on this is, are there any specific grains? So if someone was like, okay, I get it, which is really good quality grain diet, but are there any specific, from an ingredient perspective, any specific grains that you think are better than other grains when we look at ingredients?
It depends what it depends. Yeah. It depends for your dog. So some grains are higher in fiber than others. So for example, if you wanted a diet that your dog needed to lose weight, or you wanted higher fiber because they had anal gland problems, then things like barley, oats are maybe higher in fiber than rice and maize, for example. But they've all got different benefits. As I said, some grains have got gluten, some don't. There are other issues with grains. So rice, for example, can be contaminated with arsenic from the soil, and you can get mycotoxins. So if you get grains that are moldy, the mold produces these toxins, and that's not destroyed by cooking.
Interesting.
So I would say it's not good to be reliant on just one type of grain all the way through. Having a sort of a mixture or variation is always a good thing to reduce any issues, but they've all got different benefits.
Yes, absolutely. What about, again, you say it depends on a lot. I just come back with questions because I hear it all the time. So I'm like, I have the expert in front of me, I will ask. But I've seen a lot of people asking, what about the percentage of grain in some, for example, kibble? Because my understanding is grains tend to be a little bit richer in omega-6. And people's discussion is omega-6 is pro-inflammatory, omega-3s are not. They are anti-inflammatory. So if a diet is very high in omega-6, people seem to think, oh, actually, that's actually pro-inflammatory. So is too much grain bad, or is there a specific kind of number that we should be looking at to make sure we're not giving too much?
Yeah.
Because again, every company is different, and like some of them might be really high, some of them might be good, but how does someone know that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, omega-6 can be pro-inflammatory, but it is also essential. Dogs have to have it. So to have proper skin barrier, skin and coat condition, they have to have omega-6. It's just that you're right, the typical sort of diet in humans as well tends to be very omega-6 heavy and not enough omega-3. So some manufacturers counteract that. They add in other sources of omega-3. So they'll add in salmon oil or some of the newer ones like algae substances. As for the percentage of grains, there isn't really anything in the research that says don't go above this. Generally, they're very digestible. I know people say that they aren't, but the science is that they actually are very digestible if they're cooked properly. And actually, they can reduce palatability of food once they get to a certain point. So manufacturers won't go higher than a certain amount because it actually puts the dog off the food, which is nobody wants that. And again, it depends what else you're looking for. Are you just looking for your dog to be healthy? Are you looking for a food that will also help with the environment? Because very meat heavy foods and low grain foods or low carbohydrate foods are actually not going to be very good long term for environmental purposes. The theory is that there is going to be a lack of meat going forwards because there's too many humans, and therefore the parts of animals that we didn't as humans used to eat, we might start eating, and there'll be less meat to go into the pet food chain, in which case our pets might have to have a higher carbohydrate diet. Generally though, you might see some foods that are sort of 50%, 60% grain and dry foods, but you wouldn't see it higher than that. And it's what's up to your own preference of whether you prefer something lower.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And when a company doesn't, and I promise that's the last question, when a company doesn't declare the percentage, because again, sometimes it's okay, I understand it better now. Let's assume I want to be seeing between 40 to 60% max. How do I go about these companies that don't put any percentages on their labels, right? Because there are so many out there, and it's just sometimes you just find like the first 10 ingredients, and then you're like, but what how do I know? Like, first ingredients is rice, fair enough, but how much is there?
Yeah, so it's all to do with labeling rules, and the rules are that if you have that ingredient in the title of the food, so for example, if the food is called chicken and rice, then in the ingredient list you'll have to put the percentage of chicken and the percentage of rice. But if it's got other ingredients, there's no legal rule that says you have to put the percentage of the other ingredients. Some companies don't do it because they are worried that it means their recipe can be copied.
Yes.
So there is that side of things, and some just don't put it on because it saves space, and space is actually a premium on pet food bags because you've got to add on all the feeding amounts. Sometimes you have different languages, so it just cuts down on some space basically. But all reputable companies by law, actually, they have to have contact details on the packet of food, the tin of food, whatever. So you should be able to call them up and they should tell you.
And give you the answer. Yes, especially if you're concerned or something like that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Perfect. So let's move to the second one. So the second one is dogs should eat the same diet as wolves.
Yes, yeah. I don't think we hear this as much now, but there is still murmurs out, which originally a lot of the basis of sort of raw feeding came about. And let me just point out, I'm not against raw feeding, but I don't think dogs should be fed like wolves. So again, the science says that dogs did evolve from the grey wolf, but they are very different now and they have evolved. There's quite a lot of evidence to show that evolution. So the first thing to say is that grey wolves actually have an energy requirement 3.2 times higher than our pet dogs. Think of our dogs just lounging around.
Yeah.
Wolves need a much, much higher energy content from their food. So there's quite a big difference there. But also our dogs, you can see the evolution physically with obviously different breeds like Chihuahuas, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But there's evidence that their body and gut has changed too. So one of the things that can be seen in the sort of eras between the grey wolf and the dog is that the grey wolf started to change its skull morphology. So some of the skulls that have been dug up have shown that dentistry slightly changed and their jaw became shallower, and that's because their diet was starting to change to a slightly more omnivorous one.
Yeah.
So there's evidence to show that has changed. And then in the gut itself, there's quite a famous study from quite a few years ago now, but about a gene, and I never know if I'm pronouncing this right, so I'm just going to say it, but it's AMY2B. Basically, that is the gene that helps the pancreas produce amylase, which digests starch to break down carbohydrates. And dogs have a lot more copies of that gene than wolves do, although there are differences between breeds. So breeds like German Shepherds are much more closely related to the wolf. They don't have as many copies, so maybe they wouldn't be as good at digesting carbohydrates. And so there's that gene. There's also a couple of others though. There's another one, I think it's MGAM, and that is to do with conversion of different sugars. I can't remember. I think it's maltose to glucose, but don't quote me on that. And then there is another one about which is relating to glucose transport in the body. And again, dogs have a much higher, or a differentiation of that compared to wolves. So again, there has been a change. So there's quite a lot of evidence to show that they've evolved and they can have a different diet. And if we look back as well, there was a lovely study from a Bronze Age archaeological site a few years ago that showed that the dogs, they could actually tell what they'd been eating, which is amazing from so long ago. And they found that a lot of the dogs were very omnivorous. Some of them had diets really high in vegetation and grains, and some of their diets were similar to the diets of cows that they found on the same archaeological site. So they've been eating carbohydrates and vegetation and grains for thousands of years, basically.
And obviously they were used to, like, if they were used to get a rabbit and they were used to eat everything inside, the rabbit would have had food in their stomach. So that's another thing I heard, right? This is the thing, it's like they do tend to also as well prefer fruit and vegetable as opposed to just meat.
They would definitely, yeah.
It's interesting. Those studies are really interesting. I didn't know about the gene and the difference between breed as well, which I think is something we need to bear in mind based on the breed that you have, and something we should be aware of when choosing the food. And another thing I hear all the time is the amylase, the digestive enzyme. I think the big pushback is they don't have that enzyme in their saliva, which is what we have as humans. So they say if it's only in the pancreas and the carbohydrates don't start getting really digested until they hit the pancreas, so is that a problem, basically? Because everyone seems to focus on they don't have the amylase in their mouth, in their saliva. Yeah, is that a problem?
Interestingly, another study has found that they do have amylase in their saliva.
Okay.
But also a question whether how useful it would be, because we chew our food, so it's got time to be mixed with the saliva. Dogs, if they're like my dogs, it literally doesn't touch the sides. So I think it would just be a waste. But no, there's enough in their body. As I said, there's quite a lot of evidence on carbohydrates and starch and how digestible it is, and it is really digestible.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's amazing. Thanks so much for answering that. That's amazing. And then the third one is quite linked to it in a way. So cereals are just fillers with no nutritional value. And I changed my mind on compared to 6 months ago after talking to you guys. I'm learning as well every day. But yeah, what are your thoughts on cereal?
Yeah, I think it's really good that I've done that as well in my career. Like you said, nutrition changes all the time.
Yes.
And some of the opinions that I had when I first started, I've completely U-turned on as more and more evidence has come to light, or as I've learned more. And I think that's good.
Yeah.
If anyone's willing to look at the different points of view. But yeah, they're not just fillers. Grains, for example, there's lots of vitamins. You've got B vitamins in there. Some of them are really good sources of minerals like zinc, manganese. And we talked about fibre. So there's different, especially whole grains. So if you're looking for a diet with grains, whole grains would be better, same as with humans, because they've got that outer hull of the grain, and that's where you get a lot of the fibre. And you've got two types of fibre. You've got the soluble fibre that helps the dog feel full for longer. It slows the rate of emptying in the stomach. And you've got, and soluble fibre is that source of the prebiotics we mentioned. And you've got insoluble fibre, which just helps keep everything moving. So they can be really good sources of that. And they are an energy source. So you get calories from 3 nutrients. You get calories from fat, protein, and from carbohydrate. And if you need to reduce the fat in a food or the protein in a food for a dog that might have a certain health condition, then you still have to provide calories for energy. And sometimes you have to do that through the carbohydrate and all the grains.
Yeah, such a like kidney disease, right? Like a dog that has kidney disease or advanced stage kidney disease, or even a working dog, right? Because with fat, it's got how many calories?
Protein and carbs provide 3.5 calories per gram, whereas fat is 8.5. So it's much, much more.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much. And then the next one is, I heard that so much, especially with allergic dogs. Hypoallergenic means that the food won't upset my dog with sensitivities.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is not true. So hypoallergenic is a made-up word. I believe, but don't quote me, it was made up by the cosmetic industry.
Wow.
So that the makeup you were putting on your face wouldn't cause, they made it up to say, oh, it's really low, no chance of it causing allergies. And that's all it means. Hypo means low. So the suggestion is it's less likely to cause an allergic reaction. But every single pet food manufacturer, there's no legal definition for it. So everyone has their own definition. If they're a good company, they'll actually put on the packet what their definition is. So for example, it will say hypoallergenic, and then it might say underneath or on the back of the pack, we don't have any beef, dairy or wheat. And the reason they might choose those ones is because they're the most common allergens in dogs. But if your dog is allergic to a different ingredient, then that food's still going to upset them. And I think we focus a lot on allergens and not on things like fat sensitivity. So a food that's too high in fat might give your dog an upset stomach. If the fiber content is wrong, it might upset them. If the type of fiber is wrong, it might upset them. And of course, we're just focusing on the ingredients rather than the nutrient levels. And you can have a lot of sensitivities to those nutrient levels. So in that case, hypoallergenic wouldn't help you. But it is a good place to start if you've got a sensitive dog, because they do tend to avoid those more common allergens.
Normally, as far as I heard, and obviously me running the doggy daycare boarding business, I see it all the time. That is normally prescribed to dogs that have really like sensitivities like diarrhea, and people just assume straight away it's food related. Or it's like when they have itchiness, itchy ears or yeasty ears or hot spots on their skin. And so they get prescribed hypoallergenic food. But like you said, it's like, how do we know, first of all, that it's food? Because this is such a huge topic, isn't it? Like you see with the kind of like cockapoos breed, how many of them are itchy is crazy. Like I have not met a cavapoo or cockapoo that is not itchy in my life. Like they're constantly on Apoquel every single day of their life because that's a life. And so I think sometimes as well is, as far as what I heard from talking to different experts, is not always food related. So many times, like a higher percentage of time is actually environmental.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You can see that it gets worse when you get to like spring, summertime. And does it really make sense to fully go on a hypoallergenic diet for the rest of their life, when actually in reality that might not necessarily be an issue in the first place? So you're depriving them with the food they could be getting, whether it's fresh, whether it's raw, whether it's kibble, like doesn't matter. That's for me the thing, isn't it? It's like it's really difficult for people. I have so many clients. Another one is, I had dog always gets pancreatitis, and she's like, we're doing an elimination diet, and she does 8 weeks, and then all of a sudden it's like the dog gets sick again on that diet. And it's just, but it's really hard, isn't it? Because there isn't an allergy test that works out there.
No, there isn't. You're right. It is unfortunately just trial and error to see exactly what your dog can tolerate. And I always recommend people keep a food journal or a food diary for that reason, so that they can just make a note of if there is a particular flare up on when they've introduced something new or the dog's scavenged something. Certainly for skin, environmental allergies are much more common than food allergies. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, very interesting. Amazing. So the next one is animal byproducts and derivatives are harmful.
Yeah, absolutely not. I would think the main thing a way to explain them is that they are things like offal, so your liver, knees, such rich sources of nutrients. And that's something that the raw feeders would definitely, they really understand the benefits of that offal and those ingredients. They're super important to have in foods for the things like their iron contents. They're really rich in things like that. And I think what a lot of people are maybe worried about is that they think that animal byproducts are like from diseased animals, or they're just really poor quality. But Actually, certainly in the UK and the EU, all of the meat that is passed to go into pet food, it's all fit for human consumption. It's all free of disease. The only reason it doesn't go into the human food chain and it ends up in the pet food chain is because humans don't want to eat those bits. So it's not unsafe. It's perfectly fine, and the dogs love it. And a lot of us feed them as treats. So pig's ear, that pig's ear is a byproduct.
Chicken necks, chicken feet.
Yeah, exactly. If you're eating I don't personally eat this, but some people love a cooked breakfast, a fried breakfast, and they might have black pudding in that, and that's a byproduct. So no, they're perfectly safe and a really good source of nutrients.
That's amazing. I think as well is the thing that scares people or that makes everyone panic is that they can't see what's behind the name animal byproduct. So they hear the word animal byproduct, but what is it? It's like, it's very generic. I think people can, with talking with dog owners, it's just like we'll prefer a company that just lists out, okay, this is the percentage. But I think some of the big companies, it's impossible for them to like list exactly like the percentage of each byproduct that they put inside the food. And so definitely
some companies have found that actually the more transparent they are, owners don't like that even less than animal byproducts. Some people, if they see livers, it really puts them off. It's just hard to get that balance right.
Yes. No, I completely agree. But yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that one. The next one is all additives in pet food are bad.
Well, this one's really super easy to answer because no, they're not all bad. Your vitamins and your minerals are classed as additives. And actually, things like prebiotics and probiotics would be classed as additives as well.
Yes.
So I think people are thinking mainly of maybe things like synthetic preservatives like BHA or BHT that might have links to potential cancer problems, and certainly they are in some foods.
Yes.
But there are lots of really good additives that actually help the diet become much more complete. It's the same as if we have cereals, actually, breakfast cereal, when it says fortified with vitamins, they're additives. Can be good for you.
Yes, absolutely. But you're right about the BHA and BPA. I have seen studies around that, and I actually have seen that as listed at the back of the package. So at the end of the day, it's like you just need to be educated around what these things are. And if you see the things and you're like, okay, look, I'm skeptical, I've seen studies, they're linked to cancer, then you just need to choose a different food. As long as, I think as long as the company is clear on what they put and they don't just put, like, some companies, they just say additives. Additives doesn't tell me anything. As a dog owner, I want to know what you're talking, because we do know that BHA and BPA are linked to cancer. So those ingredients in there, yes or no. And that's, I think it's all again about just questioning the company.
It is, yeah. And it absolutely, don't be afraid to do that. Yeah, they don't legally have to label it, again, for various reasons, bearing in mind that when they do add those additives, they're in very small percentages, those sort of preservatives. And the alternative to not adding them sometimes is that the food goes mouldy a week after you've opened the bag. So if we want a bag of kibble that's going to last a couple of months, sometimes you need certain preservatives in there. There are natural ones though as well. So do ask the manufacturer which one they're using. If you go for a wet food that's in a can or a tray, they don't need anything like that because they are the sealing process. The sealing process helps keep them fresh, and of course the same with fresh food as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. The next one is high protein is always better. High protein diets. Clarify.
This is a really big trend, and people like with the 80-20 foods and things, like people looking for the highest protein possible. But I think what we need to remember is that our dogs can only use a certain amount of protein, and then what happens is the body can't store it. So once it's used what it needs for maintenance or repair or growth, if it's a puppy, that protein will be broken down into its building blocks, which are amino acids, and the dog will wee those out. So you're basically peeing away all the extra protein. So it's a massive waste of money if you're giving your dog really high protein diets that they're just not going to utilize. Not only is it very environmentally bad because you're using a lot of meat and you don't have to be, when the body breaks down protein, it actually creates quite toxic elements. So it creates ammonia when you break down protein, which is then converted into urea and excreted. We don't think it's bad for the dog long term, but it might just be a waste of money. Previously, it was thought that high protein diets might cause kidney disease, but that has been debunked, that sort of thing. There was a study in 2020, I haven't seen anything since, that actually tested 3 different levels of protein diet. I think one was around 18%, one was 25%. This is like a dry food. And the other was 40-something%. The researchers, though, did find that the dogs on the very high protein diet had a much higher level of metabolites, that's substances produced from metabolism, that were associated with kidney disease and inflammation.
Yeah.
And the dogs on the higher protein diet had much higher levels of that. But there was only, as with most studies, there was only 30 dogs in study. It needs a lot more research.
Yeah.
So we just don't know. But yeah, I would say they need a decent amount.
Yeah, what's the amount, like on average, that
You're
we
going to
should
be
be
shocked. They only need 8% in
really?
adult dogs. But because of like bioavailability, and we don't know how well they absorb different diets, well, if you look at the FEDIAF regulations, which is the European pet food industry standards that you want as a minimum, the minimum in an adult pet food is 18.5%.
Okay.
So it's still pretty low, because
Yes.
you see some foods that are much higher than that. But yeah, they don't need anywhere near as much as we think they do.
That's so interesting. I'm going to have a look at that study as well. I've not heard of that one before. And I think, and this is the problem with studies, isn't it? It's like everyone is so reluctant because there are so many little dogs, but also we really care about the welfare of the dogs. So we don't want to go, we want 500 dogs for 2 years on that study, because it's not fair.
No.
Yeah, it's just that balance that needs to be achieved to give people the answer, but also make sure the dogs don't get mistreated at the same time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's like the data we have so far, that's what we should be going for. That's perfect. And then one that kind of doesn't link to it, but the next one is actually homemade diets are healthier. And that I changed my mind about as well recently, 6 months ago.
That's another depends question.
It's a huge depend. That's actually
Yeah.
capital letters.
Yeah,
depend.
absolutely. Yeah. I'd say yes, in the fact that obviously we all want less processed food, fresh food. From that point of view, amazing. Yeah, I don't see anyone would argue with that. But from a safety point of view, as in being nutritionally balanced and not having deficiencies, it's very difficult to do on a home prepared diet.
Yeah.
That could be raw or cooked. So it can be done, but I would say you need to employ the services of a nutritionist that has formulation software.
Yeah.
So because it is pretty much impossible to balance a diet properly without that. And there are quite a few people out there now that will use formulation software, and then you can see exactly what you're missing. If you even certain meats and things, so if you had a high meat diet, there are different types of meats that have different benefits. For example, pork is one of the highest in thiamine, whereas some of the other meats are much lower. Loads of different things to consider. I think you might have mentioned this previously, but yeah, there's quite a few studies on home prepared diets, and studies looked at them, and they found that out of, I think it was like 200 home prepared diets, I think nearly all of them were deficient in at least one.
But of course they are. It's impossible. Even with like the tool ADF, even with that tool, and that was prior to starting DAFY. But as a dog owner, they do have a tool for dog owners. It's still, there were so many things that I still wouldn't felt confident myself with my knowledge to just go off and cook. I think first you still need to work with a nutritionist. There is no way someone could just do it at home because there are too many risks. And then the second thing that really made me like very wary, I started doing raw cooking like a year ago for Rusty homemade through ADF. And I was like, this is crazy because I'm buying meat in the supermarket. I'm not cooking it. This is not a commercial formulated. This is why I moved into gently cooked a lot more, because he was doing really well on raw commercial, but actually it's just not worth the risk for me personally. It's like you buying in the supermarket, that meat is sold because it's meant to be cooked. It's for human consumption. So I get it for a gently cooked diet, you work with a nutritionist, amazing. That could work really well. If you have a dog with a specific health condition, you're like, I just want a diet for my dog. Raw food, homemade, unless you are a nutritionist and you really understand and you know where you're sourcing it, it's very risky. We all the things that we heard about birds as well, bird flu and things like that. I'm like, it's worth the risk for your dog to get so sick that
there's that as well. There is bacterial contamination, and I know the argument is that dogs can tolerate it, and certainly in dogs there's not been as much of a risk, but in cats there's been cats that have died of bird flu from contaminated raw meat, and cats that have died of tuberculosis in this country from contaminated venison, I think it was. And I think there's one study of a human that got past E. coli from raw dog food. So I think the main thing is if you're feeding raw dog food, whether it's home prepared or commercial, and I would always say go commercial raw food because I just think it's better to be balanced.
Yes.
But the UK Pet Food have got a really good fact sheet on hygiene and handling raw food, just so that you're doing it safer and just making sure that everything is as safe and hygienic as possible, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for that. Next one, and I'm going through because I could be asking 1 million questions, but I'm not going to. Supplements are always beneficial for dogs.
Yeah, this is like one of my favourite subjects. So you might have to cut me off here.
I'll keep an eye on time.
So first thing is the supplement industry is not very well regulated. So there are a few things to be aware of if you're looking for a supplement for your pet. And that is, be aware of any adverts that sound too good to be true. There is legislation and legal requirements of what you can and can't say a supplement will do, but there's just only so many law enforcement agencies and lots of adverts and people out there selling things, so it's hard to catch up on them. But it is against the law for a pet food or a supplement to say that it will treat or cure or even help a certain condition, a medical condition, because if it can do that, it should be classed as a medicine, not a supplement or food stuff. So if they are claiming things like that, number one, that's illegal. Number two, it's probably not true. Second thing is, if you're looking for a supplement, my tips would be go for a brand that you've heard of, not an obscure one on something like Amazon that's coming from a country that's very far away. So look for a trusted company. Probably buy direct from them because there was issues with counterfeit supplements from well-known companies on those online pages recently. Always make sure that the supplement has information on the correct dosage for your dog, how much active ingredients are in there. There should always be a batch number for traceability and a best before date, and the company's details and contact details should always be on that packet as well. And if any of those are missing, then I would avoid it for sure.
Yes.
But yeah, supplements themselves, they can be useful for certain health conditions, but there's very little evidence for preventative use. So I know a lot of people give, for example, joint supplements. The dog doesn't have joint problems, but they're like, oh, just in case. Zero evidence that will do anything. Probably wasting your money. I think the other thing is that they're not always safe. So there's been a big rise in America with humans that are taking supplements, things like turmeric, because it's anti-inflammatory, getting lots of high cases of liver disease. Because just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe. So yeah, if your dog is healthy and on a complete and balanced diet, you shouldn't really need a supplement.
Yeah.
It should be more for those specific health issues, and get a reputable one.
I completely agree with you. And I think another one I will add as well on top of that is that, like you said, joint support, right? We know what the active ingredients are. Within a day of food, you can do 90% of food, 10% of treats. Okay, if your dog is prone to get arthritis, let's say a lab or like that type of breed, right? But then just add a few topper of bioavailable food that you know is like actual real food. It's not a powder form. You know where it's coming from, where you're buying it. Just add a little bit of a topper. That's what I do personally, because unless it's a specific supplement. So for example, Rassi's got a grade 1 heart murmur and I work with his cardiologist. We agreed to use COQ10 supplement. But there was a study. It wasn't a huge study, but there was a study. That I agree. But then everything else is like you said, it has to be a complete and balanced diet. Make sure they have all the nutrients they need. Okay, heart problem, make sure they don't have too much salt. Don't give him like parma ham or stuff that you know is not going to be good for them. It's just that kind of these choices you just need to be careful of. But they say it's like there are so much real food out there that, unless your dog really is ill and they really do need that support, it's just not worth, isn't it?
Yeah, and exactly what you said, working with your vet, if they've got a specific health problem, to find the right supplement, the right dose is absolutely spot on.
Yes.
And there's not a lot of evidence for a lot of supplements. So my advice is always, unless your vet suggested it, if you're trying them yourself, probably try it for 3 months. And if you're not seeing any changes in your dog, then I wouldn't continue it.
Literally,
not doing anything.
Thank you. That's really helpful. The last one you had, and then I got a couple from the survey, is, and this I love this one because that's again I changed my mind about. Reading ingredient list is enough.
Yeah, we're all so focused on the ingredients. We look at the percentage of meat and then what lovely botanicals are in there. Does it have rosehip or nettle or something? And actually that's not as important as the nutrient levels. So that's your protein, your fats, your fibers, etc. And they're super important. And I think we often bypass them unless somebody's got a dog with a specific problem. Like you mentioned, pancreatitis, so owners will often know to look for the fat level. But yeah, it's not just as simple as that ingredient list of looking at it, because it doesn't tell you very much. It also doesn't tell you how digestible the food is, anything like that. So always look at the nutrients as well. Is it too high in fat for your dog? Does your dog tend to put on weight? Do you need a higher fiber level for your dog? If he's a particularly hungry dog, maybe you look and you try and find one with a bit more fiber in it, that type of thing. And that's where those veterinary diets that we see, the sort of therapeutic diets, get a bit of a bad press because their ingredient list, I will be the first to say, looks horrific.
Yeah.
It doesn't look nice.
No.
And I think, wow, that's full of...
Yeah.
But that's because when they're formulating those diets, they're not formulating them based on ingredients. They're formulating them based on nutrient levels. For example, you mentioned renal disease, kidney disease. They need to hit a certain level of phosphorus. They need to hit a certain level of omega-3 fatty acids. And by reducing the phosphorus in those diets, these dogs can live 2 or 3 times longer than they would on a normal diet. But it's down to those things like phosphorus and sodium and protein and omega-3. It's not down to the ingredients. There's a lot more things to consider.
Yeah, I do agree. And like I've seen it firsthand when, like dogs get prescribed their food, they do get better. I had so many examples of dogs with pancreatitis, and they're like, again, all you hear though is, I don't know the percentage. And I think this is why we know who the culprits are. Fine. And we know there are big companies that they have so much research and data. And so at that point, you're like, they are thinking about getting my dog to get better. But yeah, I think it's the transparency that gets people. Is if I don't know what's in there, how am I going to feed that diet? I'm just trusting that company. Yeah. And then you hear fresh food is better from everyone else around you. And you're like, this is what I hear all the time. It's like, I don't want my dog to be on that diet forever. I want them to get better, but then I want to... And it's so hard, isn't it? Because I think if those companies were a little bit more transparent and shared a lot more, get people to really trust you. And I think that's where the problem comes, right? Like people hear different views all the time, but then they're not hearing both sides. And these big companies have got studies, like you said, that to develop a diet like that, I bet it takes years of work to be able to do that. And vets have them in the practices to try and get your dog to get better.
Exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's, as you said, years of studies and research to see what foods or what nutrients are going to help.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's interesting. I think it's starting to get better. I think it's like, I'm seeing already future. Have you heard of Royal Canin doing a fresh food diet now? Which that's exciting. Like I saw it the other day and I was like, that's amazing. So that's already a good step toward, some changes. Anyway, the last two, so that's from the survey. So the first one is vets get paid by food companies, again, to link it back, to sell this company's food. Is that a myth?
Yeah, so it is a myth. One of the jobs that I had for 6 years with a pet food company, we actually were in the same building as vet practice. So it was all part of the same company. So it was amazing. You got to share your lunch with the vets and nurses, but you needed to have a strong stomach to eat your sandwiches because of what they were talking about. But believe you me, these vets used to turn up in these old banger cars. They are not rich. They have a lot of student debt. And despite that, they do not take bribes or anything or any money off any of these pet food companies. It's just not true. They just don't get paid for that. Yeah. The reason that vets will recommend those companies is exactly what we've just been talking about, is that when the reps for the veterinary companies come round, they show the vets clinical research, and vets want scientific proof because they're scientists and they've got the proof in front of them. They can see which percentage of dogs that have improved. They've got a solution to help their clients, and that's why they recommend the foods, not because they're getting paid for it. So yeah, it's just...
Yeah. That makes sense. And I think another one I see all the time is the fact that they say, but vets are not nutritionists. Like you wouldn't go to a vet to ask like the in-depth nutrition advice. You can ask general questions, that's fine. And I think they tend to trust companies like the big companies have lots of studies behind, because they are the expert. So they're like, we want what's best for the dogs, and we see the science. And I think the problem is the fresh food companies, they don't have the studies, they don't have the money, because it costs a lot of money to do that kind of research, right? And yes, but yeah, it makes sense.
You are getting a lot of vets now that there are vet practices that will do raw food training.
I agree.
And they sell raw food, and they will look more into nutrition, but it depends their area of interest. A vet, I always think, is like a GP, like a doctor you'd see at your local surgery. But if you want a specialist in nutrition, you have to go to a veterinary nutritionist if you want that information, just like you would go to an orthopedic vet if your dog had broken in its leg or something.
Yeah.
So they've all got specialist interests. But I think most vets are willing to
listen,
discuss other options.
Yes, I completely agree with you on that. Like every single time I do that as well, they are very happy to listen. They would warn you about the risks, and you're taking them because it's your dog, but it's their job to do it. That's a great answer. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then the last one is dogs should be fed only kibble.
So they can be fed only kibble, and that's perfectly fine. There's dogs for decades that have only been eating that. I'll tell you now that the percentage of people that only feed kibble is very small. Because there's quite a lot of research on this, and most of us, myself included, will add toppers or fresh food or alternate with a bit of home cooked, or add supplements, or even just soak the dry food.
Yeah.
So the answer is that if it's a complete and balanced diet, and foods should always say that they're complete or complementary, then there's nothing wrong with just feeding dry food. That's absolutely fine. And if that's all that your budget will allow, or that's all that your dog will eat, then don't feel guilty for it. Not at all, because you're basically giving your dog everything it needs, all the vitamins and minerals, all the nutrients it needs. So that's fine. But equally, there are lots of things you can do if you want to jazz up, still feed dry food, but jazz it up a little bit. So you can soak it in warm water, you can add a topper, you can add a bit of occasional food like you suggested, like maybe you want to increase their omega-3, so you add some sardines a couple of times a week, or you give them an egg, or
like a blueberries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or a bit of gently cooked food with it. So that's what I tend to do, is mine get a bit of both. And I think as well, there are cases when you would sometimes only want to feed dry food, and that would be going back to those veterinary diets. For example, if your dog has, say, we keep saying kidneys, so I'm just going to stick with the kidney disease, you put them on that dry diet. If they're doing well on it and it's suiting them, and the kidney function is being tested regularly and they're doing really well, you don't want to add other things that are going to imbalance that, because it's low protein, it's low sodium. Anything you add could be bumping that up, and you're just undoing the benefits of the veterinary diet.
Yes.
So there are times when it is essential just to stick with it. When you're testing for allergies, you might want to stick with just one type of food, for example, because if you feed all sorts of different things, you won't know which one your dog's reacting to. But in most cases, you can give a bit of variety as well.
Yes, nice, exactly. That's amazing. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. And look, to close it off, because we talk about myths a lot, and it's why are we having these issues, because there is so much advice out there that is so conflicted and confusing. From your perspective, with all the years of like studies and work that you've done, if you had to give one piece of advice to dog owners around when looking for like dog nutrition questions out there, whether it's a vet, whether it's on Google, social media, what will it be? What are the things that people need to bear in mind?
I think the main thing would be every single dog is different. And so you can take advice from your vet, from online people, from your friends, whatever. Ultimately, it's going to come down to what suits your own dog best. How many times a day do they go to the toilet? It should be a couple of times, once or twice a day, for if they're passing stools. If they're going more than that, or it's very loose, then that particular food is not necessarily suiting them, or you're overfeeding that food. That's quite common. That can cause those problems. Or if your dog's got a very dull or flaky skin, or is molting a lot, tear staining, all of those indicate that what you're feeding maybe isn't quite right for your particular dog. So it is unfortunately trial and error. But yeah, the main thing is find something that suits them, that suits your lifestyle. Don't feel guilty about what you're feeding, as long as you're making sure it is complete and it has all the vitamins, minerals and nutrients in there that they need, then the dog will be happy.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's amazing. And Fiona, if anyone that listening to today's episode loved you so much, that wants to get in touch with you, how can they do?
Because, as I said, it's not my full-time job. I'm very poor on social media. So at the moment,
everybody's in the same boat.
So bad. So at the moment it's very old school Facebook. And so it's just Fiona Firth, pet nutritionist. So you can contact me through there, and my email address is on there as well. So it's probably the best way of doing it.
That's amazing. I'll put a link in the show notes when the episode goes live anyway. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing because I've been talking to a lot of people about, like, you really mentioned a lot the things that I really love to hear, which is evidence, science, studies. Like, these are words that I'm missing so much in this industry right now when people are giving out information. So, yeah, I really love the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been great.
And thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thank you for watching. If you found this episode helpful, follow us on Instagram. And if you want first access to DAFY, join our waitlist now. The links are in the show notes.